In 1580, Spain controlled more gold and silver than any empire in all of recorded history. Yet within 100 years, its treasury was completely empty, and its kings were bankrupt. The more gold Spain seized from the Americas, the faster its own cities fell into deep poverty, its soldiers went unpaid, and its kings begged foreign bankers for emergency loans. Welcome to True Earth History, where hidden history comes to life. Subscribe to uncover the truth behind the headlines. Spain did not slowly collapse the way most great empires do, losing important battles one by one, and quietly shrinking at its edges over many long generations of gradual and unnoticed retreat. Spain was destroyed by something it had loved and pursued more than anything else in the entire world, something it had crossed great oceans and built powerful fleets to capture. It was destroyed by gold itself, by the very treasure that was supposed to make it the most powerful, enduring, and feared nation the world had ever seen or known. Ever. To understand how this happened, you need to go back to 1492, the year Christopher Columbus sailed west under the Spanish flag and reached land that Europeans had never mapped. Columbus did not find the trade route to Asia that he was searching for, but what he found instead would permanently change the entire shape and direction of the modern world. He found two massive continents rich in resources, populated by great civilizations that had no knowledge of European armies, European weapons, or the devastating diseases that European soldiers unknowingly carried. Spain moved fast, within decades sending soldiers called conquistadors into these new lands with orders to claim territory, subdue populations, and send every piece of gold they could find back to Seville. Hernán Cortés arrived in what is now Mexico in 1519 with a force of roughly 600 soldiers and faced the enormous Aztec Empire, one of the most organized civilizations in the Americas. The Aztec ruler Moctezuma received Cortés with full ceremony, believing he may have been a figure from ancient religious prophecy, a decision that would cost him both his empire and his life. Within 2 years, Cortés had captured the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, a city that was larger and more organized than most cities that existed in Spain at that same time. The fall of Tenochtitlan sent a powerful message across the Caribbean and into South America that Spain was unstoppable, and a new wave of soldiers arrived to find more land and more treasure. Francisco Pizarro arrived in what is now Peru in 1532 with fewer than 200 men and came face to face with the Inca Empire, which controlled millions of people across vast territories. Pizarro captured the Inca ruler Atahualpa and held him for ransom, demanding one room completely filled with gold and 2 rooms filled with silver as the price for his eventual release. The Inca people filled those rooms and delivered a ransom worth billions in modern currency, making it the largest single ransom payment in the entire recorded history of human civilization. Pizarro accepted the gold and silver, then executed Atahualpa anyway, destroying all remaining trust between the two sides and crushing organized Inca resistance across the entire region within a few brutal years. These conquests opened something that Spain could never have imagined when Columbus first set sail: direct access to underground deposits of silver, so enormous they seemed almost completely impossible to believe. In 1545, Spanish explorers discovered a mountain in what is now Bolivia that was filled almost entirely with silver ore, a mountain they named Cerro Rico, which means rich mountain. Cerro Rico was not just a large deposit, it was the largest silver deposit ever found in all of human history up to that point, and it would be mined continuously for centuries. The Spanish crown immediately took control of Cerro Rico and organized a forced labor system, using local populations to dig the ore out of the mountain at enormous human cost. Thousands of workers died inside that mountain from cave-ins, from the extreme cold, from mercury poisoning used in the refining process, and from total exhaustion under brutal and relentless working conditions. But the silver kept arriving in enormous quantities, and Spain loaded it onto great ships by the ton and sent it across the Atlantic Ocean to fill the royal treasury in Seville. A second massive silver deposit was discovered in Zacatecas in what is now Mexico in 1546, just 1 year after Cerro Rico, giving Spain 2 of the richest active mines on Earth. Between the years 1500 and 1650, approximately 181 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver arrived in Spain directly from the Americas. numbers so extraordinarily large they are difficult to fully understand. To put that in perspective, Spain received more precious metal in that single century and a half than all of Europe had produced from its own mines in the previous 1,000 years. The Spanish royal court celebrated this tremendous wealth. The nobles celebrated, and King Charles I used the new riches to fund his many expensive wars across the continent of Europe. Charles fought long wars in Italy, wars against the Ottoman Empire, wars against Protestant princes in Germany, and costly wars against France, maintaining large armies across many different fronts at the same time. He financed all of this with silver from the Americas, believing that the mines would never run dry, and that Spanish military dominance could be maintained indefinitely with enough money. His son King Philip II inherited this same thinking and expanded it considerably, building the famous Spanish Armada and attempting to project overwhelming Spanish power across the entire known world. Philip funded expeditions to the Philippines, which were named after him, and established major trade routes that connected South America, Asia, and Europe in one vast and ambitious commercial network. Spain was, by any measure available at the time, the most powerful empire on earth, controlling territory on every inhabited continent and commanding the most experienced military force in all of Europe. But underneath this overwhelming display of power and wealth, something was going quietly and terribly wrong deep inside the Spanish economy, something that none of the kings or their closest advisors fully understood. The problem was not that Spain had too little gold and silver entering its ports. The problem was the exact opposite. Spain had far too much coming in far too fast. When enormous quantities of gold and silver flood into an economy faster than goods and services can grow to match them, prices begin to rise, a process economists now call inflation. This is not a modern economic theory invented after the fact. Spanish merchants and scholars actually observed and carefully described this exact phenomenon happening in real time during the 16th century. A Spanish scholar named Martín de Azpilcueta wrote about it clearly in 1556, noting that prices across Spain had risen dramatically since the treasure from the Americas first began arriving in large quantities. He understood that when more money chases the same amount of goods, each coin buys less, and the people who suffer most are those who earn fixed wages or fixed incomes. Prices in Spain rose by an estimated 400% between 1500 and 1600, meaning that something costing 1 coin at the start of the century cost 5 coins by the end. For ordinary Spanish workers and farmers, this meant that their wages bought less food, less cloth, and less of almost everything they needed each day, even as the royal court grew richer. Spanish manufacturers were hit especially hard because their production costs rose steeply, while foreign competitors, who had not received the same flood of silver, could produce comparable goods far more cheaply. A Spanish clothmaker paying high wages to workers in a high inflation economy simply could not compete with an English or Dutch clothmaker paying lower wages in a stable economy. Rather than buy expensive Spanish goods, Spanish merchants and nobles found it easier and cheaper to import foreign products, sending their silver out of Spain and into the pockets of competitors. This damaging pattern repeated itself across nearly every industry in Spain, as textiles, ceramics, metalwork, food production, and basic manufacturing all declined, and imports steadily replaced what domestic workers used to produce. Spanish industry was quietly dying at the very same moment that Spanish treasure ships were sailing home, loaded with more silver than any other country in the world had ever possessed. The kings of Spain noticed the empty treasuries but did not understand the cause, so they responded by increasing taxes on the Spanish people, which only made domestic production less competitive. They also borrowed heavily from powerful foreign banking families, particularly the Fugger family of Germany, and later Genoese bankers, pledging future silver shipments as collateral in exchange for immediate emergency cash. King Philip II declared complete bankruptcy not once but 4 times during his reign, in the years 1557, 1560, 1575, and 1596, each time defaulting on enormous debts to foreign creditors. Each bankruptcy damaged Spanish credit, raised the interest rates on future loans, and sent more silver flowing out of the country in debt payments before it could circulate in the domestic economy. The silver was passing through Spain like water through a sieve, arriving from the Americas, briefly filling royal coffers, and then flowing immediately out to pay soldiers, bankers, and foreign suppliers. Spain was becoming what historians would later describe as a transit point for global wealth, a place where treasure passed through but never accumulated in the hands of ordinary people. The nobles of Spain contributed to this problem in a significant way through a cultural attitude that looked down on manual labor, trade, and commercial activity as beneath their dignity. In Spain, honor was closely associated with military service, religious devotion, and land ownership, not with manufacturing, farming, or the kind of productive economic activity that built lasting and real national wealth. While the Dutch and English were building trading companies, developing financial instruments, and investing in productive enterprises, Spanish elites were spending their wealth on palaces, religious art, and endless expensive warfare. This cultural gap between Spain and its northern European rivals would grow wider with every decade, as the Dutch and English developed the commercial institutions that would eventually replace Spanish power. There was also the enormous cost of maintaining the empire itself, the fleets needed to patrol the Atlantic, the garrisons needed to hold colonial territories, and the administrators needed to govern them. Running an empire the size of Spain required constant and rising expenditure, and the silver from the Americas was never quite enough to cover all of these imperial obligations at once. The Spanish military, once the most feared force in Europe, began to show signs of real strain as the treasury struggled to pay soldiers on time and maintain all equipment at full readiness. In 1576, Spanish troops in the city of Antwerp, then one of the richest commercial centers in Europe, mutinied because they had not been paid, and they sacked the city in response. The sack of Antwerp, as it became known, killed thousands of civilians and destroyed a significant portion of the city, and it became a powerful rallying point for resistance against Spanish rule in the Netherlands. The Dutch revolt against Spanish rule, which began in 1568, would drag on for 80 years, consuming enormous quantities of Spanish treasure and military manpower without ever being fully resolved. Spain was fighting a war it could not afford, in a country it could not fully control, against a people who had discovered that Spanish silver could buy guns, allies, and time. Meanwhile, English privateers with the tacit approval of Queen Elizabeth I were attacking Spanish treasure ships in the Atlantic, intercepting some of the silver before it ever reached Seville. Francis Drake raided Spanish ports in the Caribbean, attacked the Pacific coast of South America, and in 1587 sailed directly into the harbor of Cadiz and destroyed much of the Spanish fleet. Philip II responded by assembling the famous Spanish Armada in 1588, a fleet of 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, intended to invade England and destroy the Protestant rival to Spanish power. The Armada failed, defeated by a combination of English naval tactics, a violent storm in the North Sea, and navigational errors that sent ships crashing onto the rocks off Ireland and Scotland. Spain lost roughly half its fleet and thousands of its sailors, a blow that was as much psychological as it was military, because it shattered completely the long-standing image of Spanish invincibility. Other European powers took careful note that Spain could indeed be beaten at sea, and competition for Atlantic trade routes, colonial territories, and commercial dominance intensified sharply in the years that followed. The Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, began systematically challenging Spanish and Portuguese control of Asian trade routes, backed by sophisticated financial instruments and a highly aggressive commercial strategy. The English were doing the same in the Americas and Asia, establishing colonies, disrupting Spanish trade, and building the commercial networks that would eventually make Britain the dominant global power. Spain was being outcompeted, not by armies, though armies were certainly involved, but by a new model of economic organization that Spain had never developed and did not know how to counter. Back in Spain itself, the visible social consequences of decades of severe inflation, deep deindustrialization, and economic mismanagement were becoming impossible to ignore in the crowded streets of Madrid and Seville. Population growth had stalled, Agricultural output was declining steadily, and a series of devastating plague outbreaks in the late 16th and early 17th centuries killed an estimated 600,000 Spanish people. The expulsion of the Moriscos, Spanish residents of Moorish descent, between 1609 and 1614 removed an estimated 300,000 people who had been absolutely central to Spanish agriculture and skilled trades for generations. This politically motivated decision stripped entire regions of Spain of the farmers, skilled craftspeople, and local traders who had quietly kept regional economies functioning for many long and productive generations. Regions of Valencia and Aragon lost more than a full third of their entire populations almost overnight, leaving fertile fields unfarmed, ancient irrigation systems unmaintained, and once busy workshops standing completely empty. The Spanish countryside, which had already been struggling badly under heavy taxes and rising prices, was now facing outright depopulation in some of its most historically productive and once thriving agricultural zones. In the cities, a class of people called the picaros, or rogues, had grown large enough to become a recognized social phenomenon. Displaced workers surviving by begging, theft, or service. Spanish literature of this period, the famous picaresque novels, reflected this social reality directly, telling stories of clever, desperate young people navigating a world where honest work no longer paid. Lazarillo de Tormes, published in 1554, told the story of a poor boy serving a series of masters, each poorer and more desperate than the last, a dark mirror of Spanish society. These novels were enormously popular because they captured something real, the experience of living in a country where the official story of wealth and power did not match daily life. The Spanish crown tried various desperate measures to address these deep problems, including price controls, import restrictions, new and heavier taxes, and monetary experiments. But none of them addressed the underlying structural weaknesses. Price controls failed because they disrupted supply chains and caused shortages, while import restrictions failed because Spain lacked any sufficient domestic industry to replace the goods that were being blocked from entry. New taxes made Spanish goods even less competitive internationally and drove more ordinary workers into poverty, creating a worsening cycle that no economic policy of that era had the tools to break. The silver from the Americas continued to arrive, but the amounts were beginning to decline as the richest and most accessible ore had already been extracted from Cerro Rico and Zacatecas. Mining output had peaked in the 1590s and then began a long, gradual decline that would continue throughout the entire 17th century, quietly removing the financial foundation of all Spanish imperial ambition. Spain was approaching a moment of reckoning, a point where the gap between its imperial commitments and its actual economic capacity could no longer be bridged by borrowing or wishful thinking. The 17th century would bring that reckoning in full force through military defeats, political humiliations, and the slow, painful recognition that gold had not made Spain great, it had made Spain fragile. The year 1640 marked the beginning of the end for the Spanish Empire, as two of its most important territories, Portugal and Catalonia, rose in open revolt against the crown on the same day. Spain did not have the money or the military strength to crush both rebellions at once, and the simultaneous failure to do so exposed just how hollow its imperial power had become. Portugal had been under Spanish control since 1580, when Philip II absorbed it into his empire. But decades of neglect and heavy taxation had turned Portuguese loyalty into deep and lasting resentment. When Portugal broke free in 1640, Spain lost access to the Portuguese Atlantic trading network, the Portuguese colonies in Brazil, Africa, and Asia, and an enormous source of commercial revenue. The loss of Portugal was not just a political humiliation, it was a severe commercial catastrophe that further weakened the already fragile Spanish financial system at the worst possible moment in its history. Catalonia, the northeastern region of Spain, also rose in 1640 after years of being forced to house and feed Spanish soldiers fighting wars in France that Catalans had no desire to support. The Count Duke of Olivares, the powerful chief minister running Spain on behalf of King Philip IV, had pushed aggressively for greater financial contributions from the Spanish regions, and Catalonia finally refused. Olivares believed that Castile, the central region of Spain, had been carrying too much of the imperial burden alone, and he designed a plan called the Union of Arms to spread the cost. The Union of Arms was meant to make every region of Spain contribute soldiers and money to imperial defense, but it was seen as an attack on regional rights, and it sparked immediate resistance. The revolts in Portugal and Catalonia happened because Spain had been spending beyond its means for so long that it was now demanding sacrifices from people who had received nothing in return. The silver from the Americas had allowed Spanish kings to avoid making hard choices for many decades, borrowing against future shipments instead of building any sustainable economic foundation at home. Now the silver was declining, the debts were enormous, the wars were unwinnable, and the political structure of the empire was beginning to crack under the pressure of its own weight. The 30 Years' War, which consumed all of Europe from 1618 to 1648, drew Spain into another long and ruinously expensive military commitment on behalf of its Habsburg relatives governing in Austria. Spain sent armies into Germany, fought France along multiple borders, and attempted to maintain its position as the dominant military power in Europe, even as its financial foundations crumbled beneath it. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 ended the 30 Years' War and formally recognized the independence of the Dutch Republic, the very territory that Spain had been fighting to hold for 80 years. Spain signed that treaty accepting the loss of the Netherlands, the most humiliating diplomatic moment in its history, acknowledging that 80 years of warfare and enormous treasure had accomplished nothing. The Dutch Republic that Spain had failed to destroy had become, by the time of that treaty, one of the most commercially sophisticated and financially powerful nations in the entire world. Amsterdam had replaced Antwerp as the commercial center of Europe. The Amsterdam Exchange Bank was pioneering modern financial instruments, and Dutch trading companies were operating across every ocean on Earth. The Dutch had built what Spanish gold could never have created: a diversified commercial economy with a skilled workforce, advanced manufacturing, global trade networks, and a culture that valued productive enterprise. Spain looked at Dutch prosperity and saw the direct consequence of its own failures. The wealth it had shipped out of the Americas had flowed through Spain and pooled in the hands of its rivals. Back in Madrid, the court of Philip IV was maintaining an elaborate performance of wealth and grandeur that bore almost no relationship to the actual financial condition of the kingdom. The royal palace was filled with art, gold decoration, and ceremonial display. While outside its walls, Spanish cities were emptying, farms were abandoned, and the treasury owed money it could never repay. Philip IV was a great patron of the arts and the employer of the painter Diego Velázquez, whose portraits of the Spanish royal family captured something haunting in their formal composure. Velázquez painted the Spanish court at the peak of its cultural refinement and the depth of its political decline, faces full of dignity in a kingdom that was quietly losing everything. The gap between image and reality that Velázquez captured in paint was the same gap that was destroying Spain economically. The insistence on performing wealth while the actual sources of wealth disappeared. Silver production at Cerro Rico had dropped significantly by the 1650s, not because the mountain was fully exhausted, but because the easily reached ore had been extracted, and deeper mining required more investment. Spain did not have the capital to invest in deeper, more efficient mining operations because every available resource was being consumed by warfare, debt repayment, and the maintenance of the imperial bureaucracy. The empire was trapped in a cycle it could not escape. It needed silver to pay for wars, but the wars were consuming the very resources needed to extract more silver. Meanwhile, the population of Spain itself had declined significantly, from an estimated 8 million people in 1600 to approximately 7 million by 1700, a loss that reduced both the workforce and the tax base. Labor shortages meant that wages rose in some sectors while agricultural output fell, creating local food shortages in regions that had once been productive enough to export grain to other parts of Europe. The Spanish wool trade, once one of the most important industries in the country, had collapsed as English and Dutch manufacturers outcompeted Spanish producers with better technology and lower operating costs. The great sheep ranching organization known as the Mesta, which had once held enormous political power in Castile, was losing influence as the land it had grazed was converted to crops that never yielded enough. Spain had also failed to develop the banking and financial institutions that its northern European competitors had built, leaving it dependent on foreign creditors for the capital it needed to function. Genoese bankers had become the primary financiers of the Spanish crown, charging high interest rates and effectively capturing a significant portion of every silver shipment before it could be used for anything else. Historians have calculated that by the mid-17th century, as much as 2/3 of the silver arriving from the Americas was immediately committed to debt service payments before the Spanish crown could touch it. Spain was receiving enormous quantities of silver and sending 2/3 of it directly to foreign bankers, keeping only 1/3 for itself, and that third was still not enough to cover its expenses. The Treaty of the Pyrenees in 1659 ended a long war with France and required Spain to cede significant territories along the French border. Another diplomatic defeat that shrank the empire further. France under Cardinal Mazarin and later King Louis XIV had recognized that Spain was weakening, and French policy increasingly focused on exploiting that weakness to expand French territory and influence. Louis XIV would spend the next 4 decades systematically dismantling what remained of Spanish power in Europe, using a combination of military pressure, diplomatic skill, and clear economic superiority. The War of Devolution in 1667, the Franco-Dutch War in 1672, and a series of subsequent conflicts all resulted in Spanish territorial losses as France pushed its borders outward at Spanish expense. Spain could no longer field the armies it had once commanded, not because it lacked men, but because it lacked the money to equip them, pay them reliably, and keep them in the field. The famous Spanish infantry formations known as the tercios, which had been the most feared soldiers in all of Europe for more than a full century, were no longer the dominant force on European battlefields. New tactics, more powerful artillery, and more disciplined armies, funded by wealthier states, had made the traditional Spanish military approach obsolete, and Spain lacked the resources needed to modernize and fully adapt. The Spanish Navy, once the largest and most powerful in the world, had also declined dramatically, unable to keep up with the shipbuilding programs of England and the Dutch Republic. Control of the Atlantic sea lanes, which had been the foundation of Spanish power, was slowly passing to English and Dutch hands, threatening the supply lines between Spain and its American colonies. English pirates, and later formal naval operations, were increasingly able to intercept Spanish shipping, and the flow of silver from the Americas became less reliable and more vulnerable with every decade. When King Charles II of Spain died in 1700 without an heir, the crisis that had been building for over a century finally exploded into a European-wide conflict over who would control Spain. Charles II had been physically frail and mentally limited throughout his reign, the product of generations of close intermarriage within the Habsburg dynasty that had weakened the royal bloodline severely. His death without children triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted from 1701 to 1714 and drew in virtually every major power in Europe, all fighting over the Spanish inheritance. France supported Philip of Anjou, the grandson of Louis XIV, while England, the Dutch Republic, and Austria supported Archduke Charles of Austria, and the resulting war devastated Spain itself. The War of the Spanish Succession was fought partly on Spanish soil, with foreign armies marching through Castile, Aragon, and Catalonia, destroying crops, burning towns, and deepening the misery of ordinary people. Catalonia supported the Austrian claimant and fought against the Bourbon candidate, and when Philip of Anjou won and became King Philip V, Catalonia was punished with the loss of its historic rights. The war ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which confirmed the Bourbon dynasty on the Spanish throne, but required Spain to permanently surrender its remaining European territories to other powers. Spain gave up the Spanish Netherlands, Milan, Naples, Sardinia, and Sicily, territories that had defined its European empire for more than 2 centuries, all surrendered in a single devastating diplomatic settlement. It also surrendered Gibraltar to Britain, a small rock at the entrance to the Mediterranean that Britain has held ever since, a permanent symbol of Spanish decline carved into the geography of Europe. The Spain that emerged from the War of the Spanish Succession was a different country, from the one that had sent Columbus across the Atlantic or financed the conquest of the Americas. It was a Bourbon monarchy now, reorganized along French administrative lines, its European empire entirely gone, its military severely diminished, its economy deeply weakened, and its once global dominance reduced to memory. The new Bourbon kings did attempt genuine reforms, introducing more efficient tax systems, reducing the power of the church in economic affairs, and trying to revive domestic manufacturing and trade. These Bourbon reforms achieved some genuine success. And Spain did recover somewhat during the 18th century, rebuilding trade networks, improving agricultural output, and developing a more modern administrative structure across the kingdom. But Spain never regained the dominant position it had held in the 16th century, because the world had changed around it in ways that no reform program could fully reverse. Britain and France had become the dominant Atlantic powers. Their commercial networks, financial systems, and industrial capabilities so far ahead of Spain that the gap was structural rather than temporary. The Industrial Revolution, which began in Britain in the late 18th century, would widen that gap further still, creating a new basis for national power that Spain was poorly positioned to develop. The American colonies, which had once been the source of Spanish wealth, were also changing, developing local economies, local identities, and eventually local demands for independence that Spain could not satisfy. When Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808 and placed his brother on the Spanish throne, the colonial empire began to unravel with remarkable speed as colony after colony declared independence in the years that followed. By 1826, Spain had lost nearly all of its American empire. The territories that had provided the silver that had defined Spanish power for 3 centuries were now independent nations. The last remnants of the Spanish Empire, Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, were lost in 1898 following a brief war with the United States, ending 4 centuries of Spanish imperial ambition. Historians looking back at this long arc of decline have identified the paradox at its center with a clarity that was impossible for those living through it to fully perceive. The silver and gold from the Americas had given Spain the resources to project power across the entire world, but it had done so without building the economic foundations that sustain power. Real national wealth is not measured in the stock of gold in a treasury. It is measured in the productive capacity of farms, workshops, factories, trading networks, and skilled workers. Spain accumulated gold and silver, but neglected the productive capacity of its economy. And when the gold and silver stopped arriving in sufficient quantities, there was nothing underneath to support the structure. The Dutch and the English understood something that Spain did not. That wealth is created by producing things, trading things, and organizing financial systems that allow investment to generate more investment. Gold dug from a mountain and shipped across an ocean is a one-time extraction. It cannot grow or compound. And once it is spent, it is gone, leaving nothing behind but debt. The economist Adam Smith, writing in 1776, used the Spanish experience as one of his central examples of why nations that confuse gold with wealth inevitably end up poorer than nations that do not. Smith argued that the discovery of America and the silver mines of the Americas had actually harmed Spain by encouraging it to rely on extraction rather than developing productive industries that create lasting prosperity. This insight, that extracting natural resources without building productive capacity leads to long-term decline, is now recognized by economists and historians as one of the most important lessons of the early modern era. Countries that discover sudden wealth from natural resources and fail to build productive economies around that wealth are said by economists to suffer from what researchers call the resource curse. Spain, in the 16th and 17th centuries, is the original and most dramatic example of this phenomenon, studied in universities around the world as a warning about the limits of resource-based wealth. The irony is that the people of the Americas who suffered most from the Spanish conquest, who were forced into mines, stripped of their lands, and destroyed by disease, gained almost nothing from this process. The silver they dug from the earth at the cost of their lives passed through Spain, enriched foreign bankers, funded distant wars, and ultimately helped build the commercial empires of Spanish competitors. Cerro Rico, The rich mountain that produced so much of the silver that shaped early modern history still stands in what is now Bolivia, still being mined today, still yielding silver ore. The city of Potosi, that grew around Cerro Rico, was once one of the largest cities in the world, with a population in the early 17th century comparable to London or Paris. Today, Potosi is one of the poorest cities in one of the poorest countries in South America, a place where the memory of all that extracted wealth makes the present poverty even harder to understand. The mountain gave its silver to Spain, Spain gave its silver to Europe, Europe built the modern world, and the people who lived beside the mountain were left with almost nothing. This is the full circle of the story, beginning with the Spanish dream of endless treasure and ending with recognition of what treasure costs when it is taken without building anything lasting. Spain is today a prosperous and democratic country, a full member of the European Union with a modern economy, strong institutions, and a standard of living its 16th century kings could not have imagined. That recovery took centuries and came through genuine economic development, through building industries, educating workers, developing financial systems, and joining the integrated European economy rather than standing apart from it. The lesson Spain eventually learned, the lesson it teaches the world through its history, is that sustainable wealth comes from what a nation builds, not from what it extracts or inherits. The gold and silver are long gone, spent on wars that ended in defeat, on debts that were never repaid, on an empire that could not sustain itself because its foundations were never solid. What remains is the history, the cathedrals, the art, the literature, and the cautionary story of a nation that held more treasure than any kingdom in history and still found a way to lose everything. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel. The past holds powerful lessons, and I will help you discover them.